What's up, kings and queens? It's your boy Dan from Daft Previews, and I'm here to give you a comprehensive NBA player prop preview for this upcoming slate. In this video, I'll share my screen. I'll take you through Outlier. We'll go through all the key matchups, all the key players, talking about their forms, the matchups, their prop lines, and I'll tell you what I like and I'll tell you what I don't. And I do all this to hopefully help you out before you place all your bets on this slate. Now, I am letting you know I'm switching up the strategy. I've already done the research for my picks. Normally I wait till after, but I've already done that. So I've got a good idea of what I'm betting on. But I'm here today to show you everything that we got on the slate. Now let's go. So kicking things off with the Houston Rockets versus the Cleveland Cavaliers. No game time decision in this one, but reminder, Şengün is out. Evan Mobley still out for the Cleveland Cavs. We'll start with the Rockets first. Let's kick it off with Fred VanVleet. Now, his points prop in this game is 19.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10, which is great. Somewhat difficult matchup against Cleveland, though. But in saying that, he scored 27 points the last time they played. His assist prop, that's at 7.5. Difficult matchup here against Cleveland, but he's covered this in 6 out of his last 10 games. Well, 6 out of his last 7, really. Has seen a big uplift in his assist rate with no Şengün in the lineup. So I do like this play. In terms of head-to-head matchups, he had 17 assists the last time these teams played. 17. I kid you not. That's not a typo. Now, I'll let you know, the odds for this are great. It's plus money. This is one of the bets that I've already taken. I did consider his points prop, but I do like his assist prop a lot better. His potential assists go up without Şengün. Obviously, 6 out of his last 7 is great. It is a home game for Houston as well, which means the younger players and his supporting cast should play a lot better on the offensive end. And he got that 7 assists against them last time. That was on the road in Cleveland, back at home. Not saying that he'll do 17, but I'm confident he can come to 7.5. To get this at plus money, I think is an absolute steal. So this is definitely one of the plays that I'm taking. If you want to look at his rebound plays, it's 3.5, 6.5, 6 out of his last 10. Did have 8 rebounds in that last game against the Cavs. And then his 3-point prop, that's 2.5. Minus 155, though. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10. Matchup is difficult, but he made 4 3-pointers last time against Cleveland. So he killed it last time against them. A lot of points, a lot of rebounds, a lot of assists, and a lot of threes. I doubt that he does it again, but out of all of his props, I'd say the assist prop is the one I'm most confident in taking. Jumping into Jabari Smith Jr., his points prop 13.5. The matchup with Cleveland, somewhat difficult, but keeping in mind there's no Evan Mobley. Now, he's covered this in 7 out of his last 10 games, which is great, but he's only covered in 1 of his last 3 against the Cavs. His rebound prop, 8.5. Difficult matchup, 6 out of his last 10, and has gone under in 3 consecutive games against the Cavs. No Şengün in the lineup, but in saying that, no Şengün against Washington, and he still went under anyway. So not a sweet science there, not as straightforward. Jalen Green, definitely seen an uplift in his performance with no Şengün in the lineup. Scored 37 points against the Washington Wizards, but keeping in mind that was a great matchup. The Cavs do have some shot blockers, so getting to the rim may not be as easy, but let's see how the numbers look. 20.5 is the line. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. The matchup with Cleveland's a difficult one, and he's covered in 1 of 3 against them. His assist prop, 3.5. 4 out of his last 10, 1 out of his last 3 against the Cavs. And his rebound prop, 5 out of his last 10 games, and 1 of 3 against the Cavs. So Jalen Green, somewhat inconsistent. I am going to bet on him if there's no Şengün in the lineup at some point in the future, I'm sure. But we need to wait for the perfect matchup for me to take that. Jumping over to the Cavs, let's have a look at Darius Garland. His points prop here is at 18.5. The matchup's not too bad, but he's covered in 6 out of his last 10. In terms of head-to-head matchups, covered in 1 of his last 2. His 3-point market has been a popular play in the past, and you can see why he's been hitting it quite well. Line's at 2.5. He's covered in 8 out of his last 10. The matchup is not overly difficult, but in head-to-head matchups, he has covered in 1 of his last 2. I only had 1 3-pointer made the last time these teams went at it. But if you look at his 3-point prop, it's honestly not too bad. The activity's there. He's taking 10 3-pointers per game on average over his last 10 games. But I've found 3-point props haven't been the kindest to me, so I'm not going to be touching it. His assist prop, 6.5, covering in 5 of his last 10 games and in 2 consecutive games against the Houston Rockets. And his rebound prop is 2.5, 4 of his last 10, and in 2 straight games against the Rockets. So Garland's numbers, honestly not looking too bad. Let's have a look at Donovan Mitchell. So there's 23.5 Or you can take 24.5 and get plus money, but let's just start with 23.5. 6 out of his last 10 he's covered. The matchup against the Rockets is somewhat difficult. He did score 37 points the last time they played, covering in one of his last 2. His 3-point props at about 3. He's covered that in 7 of his last 10, and he's made 4 3-pointers in his last 2 games against the Houston Rockets. His assist props at 5.5. He's covered this in 4 out of his last 10, and 1 of his last 2 against the Rockets. And his rebound prop, 5.5. He's only covered that in 3 of his last 10 games, and he went under in both games against the Rockets. And the last one there is probably Jared Allen. Let's check out Jared Allen, JA. His line's at 17.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. The matchup, somewhat difficult, but no Şengün. Will that be easier? Potentially. So 5 out of his last 10. He's only covered in 1 of his last 3 against them. And his rebound prop, 12.5. 3 out of his last 10. And only 1 of his last 3 against the Rockets. Now, there is a good hit rate here in his assists, but the odds aren't great. But he's covered that in 8 out of his last 10, and he's covered in 2 straight games against the Rockets. But the odds not too favorable there. Let's get into the next game. It's the Brooklyn Nets versus the Indiana Pacers. So no key outs or anything in this game, so a lot of players are available. Let's get into the key ones, starting with Dennis Schroeder. Look at his points or his assist prop, because they've been quite well. I've actually had some success betting with Dennis Schroeder in the past, so let's see how we look at points prop is 13.5. He's covered this in 7 out of his last 10 games, which is pretty good. The games he went under, scored 13 and 12 points. Yet to verse the Indiana Pacers, but in terms of the matchup, it's not a difficult one and it's not a hard one either. Cam Thomas is in the lineup, so that could have some impact on Dennis Schroeder's ability to score some points, but it might help him on the assist front. His line there is 6.5. He's covered this in 7 out of his last 10. He does have one of the most difficult matchups here. The Pacers don't allow many assists to point guards, so points might be the better option. Looking at Nick Claxton. So Nick Claxton, he's got a difficult matchup here up against Miles Turner, but he has covered in 6 out of his last 7 games. Against the Pacers, he's covered in his last 2. He's covered that 11.5. His rebound prop, 9.5. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10 games and 1 of 3 games against the Indiana Pacers. Having a look at Cam Thomas. So he does have a good matchup here against the Pacers. Allow a lot of points to shooting guards, but he's only covered in 4 out of his last 10. He did score 33 points the last time he played the Pacers, though. And if you like his 3-point market, 2.5's the line. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. And he had 3 the last time he versed the Pacers. So there's a bit of Cam Thomas. And then one of my favorite all-time players, I hope you can hear the sarcasm in that, Mikal Bridges. 19.5 points is his line. Got a good matchup here against the Pacers, but he's covered in only 2 of his last 10 games. If you want to look at his assist prop, that's at 3.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10, and his rebound prop, 4.5, covering in 5 out of his last 10 games. So he does have a good matchup for all props. He's just wildly inconsistent and still not somebody that I would ever bet on. Let's have a look at Tyrese Halliburton. Now, the matchup here is good if you like his points prop. Unfortunately, the line they've set it at, he's only covered in 2 out of his last 10 games. But against Brooklyn, had a lot of success. He's covered in 3 out of his last 4, scored 35 points the last time he played them. But keeping in mind, this was back in 2022, so it's been some time. Looking at his assist prop, lines at 11.5. Tough matchup here against Brooklyn. He's covered in 4 of his last 10, 1 of his last 4 against the Brooklyn Nets. Having a look at Pascal Siakam now. 20.5 is his points line. Tough matchup here against Brooklyn. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 games. If you want to look at his assist prop, that's at 3.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 games. Difficult matchup. And his rebound prop is at 7.5. The matchup isn't too difficult here, but he's covered this in 7 out of his last 10. Like Pascal Siakam, I'd probably lean the under in his points plus assists. I know the matchup is difficult. Dorian Finney-Smith been making life hell for a lot of power forwards out there. So maybe an under 24.5 on his points plus assists. As you can see here on the right side, difficult matchup for points and assists. He's also gone under in 7 out of his last 10 games. If you looked at the under, you get minus 119 though. So I'm not sure if I want to muck around with that. And let's have a look at Miles Turner. So his points prop here is 16.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10, 1 out of his last 3 against the Brooklyn Nets. In terms of the matchup, it is a difficult one if you're going to score some points. And his rebound line is at 7.5. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10, 1 out of his last 3, and the matchup's also difficult. So, yeah, nothing crazy screamed out to me from that game. I don't throw to points, not gonna lie, and Pascal Siakam under points and assists, but those are probably leans for me at the moment. Jumping into the Charlotte Hornets versus the Philadelphia 76ers, Tobias Harris is a game time decision in this game. LaMelo Ball might be making his return. So initially I was looking at jumping on my man Michik. He's been killing it on the points front, as you can see. I made an error and took his 3-point market there against Phoenix. He didn't make any, but he still scored 21 points. So his points prop was definitely the way to go. But he's been killing it, and I was close to backing him again, but there's a chance that LaMelo Ball's going to play. So if LaMelo's in there, I probably wouldn't feel as confident taking his over in points. But let's have a look at this. So he's covered his points line in 7 out of his last 10, and he scored 13 points last time against Philly. Looking at his assist prop, that's at 6.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10, and he had 7 assists against Philly last time. So there's a lot of reasons to bet he's over in points plus assists, or even just points, but the LaMelo Ball factor leaves me to be a little bit hesitant. It's very much the same with Trey Mann. I was actually looking at his under in points plus rebounds, I think. But when LaMelo Ball's there, his Trey Mann scoring does go up. It's a very small sample size, of course, but Trey Mann becomes probably plays that Terry Rozier role. But looking at his points prop, 4 out of his last 10, he's covered. Only had 9 points against them last time. His assist prop, 4.5. He's covered in 2 out of his last 10. Had 6 assists against them last time. And his rebound prop, 4.5. 4 out of his last 10. Only had 3 rebounds. So, yeah, his points and his rebounds, he struggled against them last time. And I thought, good chance to take the under here again. But with LaMelo Ball back, his scoring actually goes up. So I was a little bit hesitant to take that. If I'm alert to when and if LaMelo Ball does play, then I can make a decision from there. Let's have a look at Miles Bridges. So his points props at 21.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. I've covered this line in 2 consecutive games against the 76ers now. His rebound props, 8.5. He's got a great matchup here. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10 games, and he's covered it in 3 consecutive games against the 76ers. So this is definitely a lean for me. One that I strongly considered. I've been hurt before betting his rebound prop, to be honest, but it's still something I might consider. I'm still a bit on the fence about it, to be honest, but I actually deleted it from my sheet, but now I'm looking over this again. I might consider it once more. One more time. Let me have a look, because I want to check to see what the LaMelo Ball impact is, if any. All right. So who else is there? There's Nick Richards. I just want to check his rebounds, really, because his points props a bit average, but rebound-wise, he can get it done. So the matchup is somewhat difficult against Philly, but obviously there's no Embiid here. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10, and he struggled against Philly in the past, so not something I'm willing to take. Let's jump into these 76ers. We've got Kelly Oubre. His points prop is 17.5. He's covered this in 6 out of his last 10. Now, I'm just checking to see where he's going to be starting at the 2 or the 3. It looks like he'll be starting at 3. So he does have I'd say, good matchup here against Charlotte. It is his old team, of course. So he's covered in 6 out of his last 10, but he's gone under in his last 2 games against Charlotte. So that's no good. Who else have we got? Tyrese Maxey. So his points prop, 27.5. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10 games. Did score 33 points the last time he versed Charlotte, but prior to that, he went under in 3 straight games. You like his assists, the line's at 5.5. He's only covered in 3 out of his last 10 and 2 out of his last 4 against the Charlotte Hornets. So the matchup, somewhat difficult there for Tyrese Maxey, but still could be worth a play. And probably my favorite player of all time, Tobias Harris, not. He's questionable for this game, but if you want to know his numbers, points-wise, 3 out of his last 10, he's covered 18.5. Did score 31 points the last time against Charlotte, and he's covered in 3 of his last 6 against them. And his rebound line is at 7.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. And he had 12 rebounds against Charlotte last time, but had struggled prior to that. So the Tobias Harris experience. Now, next one is the Portland Trailblazers versus the New Orleans Pelicans. I think I've got 2 bets in this game, but let's see. Let's get through it. We'll start with the New Orleans Pelicans. fully healthy. Everybody expecting him to play. Start with Zion Williamson. So his points prop here is at 22.5. It's minus 119. I actually did some line shopping and I found much better odds for that. So I took him at over 23.5, but I got pretty great odds. And look, this is one of the best that I'm running with. So Zion, the matchup, I'm not bad to be honest, but his recent form has been very impressive. He's covered in 6 of his last 10, and he's covered in 4 straight. Now against the Portland Trailblazers, he scored 29 points. I did dive in a little bit further to see what's been happening, and I think in every single game Zion has played against the Portland Trailblazers, he's covered this 22.5 points. I think that might be 4 or 5 games, to be honest, but yeah, he's covered it very well against him in the past. His recent form is great. His shot attempts are a lot higher. His percentage is very good. So he's quite aggressive getting to the basket. So I do like it. The line is 13.5. So the blowout there is a risk, but I think Zion, this is quite a low line, 22.5. If this was 24.5, I'd probably, I'd be a little bit hesitant. But at 22.5 or 23.5, I'd still take that. So there's his points prop. Looking at his rebounds, 6.5 is his line. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10 and had 6 rebounds last time against the Trailblazers. And his assist prop, 5 out of his last 10, and he went under his assist prop with 3 the last time against them. So, yeah, I'm liking Zion on points. Who else do we have? CJ McCollum. So one of the players who actually let me down more recently, took his 3-point prop. I think he shot 1 for 7 from deep, so that was a bit painful. But up against his old team, the Portland Trailblazers, he's covered in 4 out of his last 10 games. In head-to-head matchups, he's covered in 3 out of his last 5. So his assist prop, I did consider this one and dive a little bit further into it. So I know he's only covered in 4 out of his last 10. But if you check out his head-to-head matchups, check this out. 7, 7, 11, 8, and 7 assists against the Portland Trailblazers. The last 5 times he's played them. He also got 3.5 assists at plus money. But I did a dive and I looked into it. On the season, I think he's averaging like 7 potential assists per game or something like that. Obviously, Zion and Brandon Ingram averaging a lot more. And then in his last 10 games, that's actually dropped to like 4 or 5 potential assists. So Zion and Brandon Ingram creating much more of the offense, meaning CJ McCollum not getting many assists. So just because this previous form looks great, I've already looked into it, and it's not something I'm willing to take. But look, he could still go over, but I found reasons not to bet it. His rebound line, though, that's at 3.5. He's covered this in 7 out of his last 10, and he's hit this in 3 out of his last 5. But his last 2 games against Portland, he did go under. Yeah, I was a bit hesitant to bet on him. Brandon Ingram, so his points prop here is at 20.5. He's got a good matchup, but matchups don't matter with Brandon Ingram. He does whatever he wants. He's had good matchups before, and he's gone under. So he's covered in 4 of his last 10, but he has gone under in 5 straight. In head-to-head matches, he's gone over in 2 out of his last 4. His assist prop is probably his most reliable prop if you're looking at form, but that's recently been lifted to 6.5. Previously, that was 4.5 or 5.5, but yeah, he got too consistent. Now it's moved up. So he's only hit this in 3 out of his last 10. He does have a good matchup. He had 9 assists against Portland last time, but only covered in 1 of his last 4. And then his rebounds prop. That is at 5.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. And in head-to-head matchups, 2 out of his last 4. All right. The big fella, Jonas Valanciunas. Points-wise, you're looking at 9.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. He has covered in 3 consecutive games against the Trailblazers, so he does have a good matchup, and he's got some good recent form. He's got bad recent form, but he's good form against the opponent. So the problem I'm finding with Valanciunas, he's playing less and less minutes. So his minutes seem to be dropping. And looking at his rebound prop, you're getting 7.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10. He does have a great record against the Trailblazers, but once again, he was playing at least 25 minutes a night in these 4 games. Over his last 10, he's playing less than 20. So, yeah, I'd be a little bit hesitant to bet on Jonas, but look, I wouldn't be surprised if he does have a big game. Having a look at these Portland Trailblazers now. We'll start with DeAndre Ayton. Now, I have taken a bet on DeAndre Ayton. So let me double check to see what I took. So I actually took his over in his PRA. So we'll go through each prop and then I'll talk through the reasons why I took the PRA bet. So his points prop, 19.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10. He's got a pretty good, well, not a pretty good, but the matchup's not too difficult against Jonas Valanciunas. In head-to-head matchups, he scored 18 points the last time they played. That game, very low scoring, 93 to 84. Looking at his rebounds prop, that's at 12.5. He's got a good matchup here against them. He's been rebounding like a beast lately, 7 out of his last 10. His last matchup with the Pelicans, he had 17 boards, so we like that. And if you want to look at his assist prop, that's at only 1.5. Now, as of late, hasn't been getting many assists because he's been scoring a lot more, but he has covered in 5 of his last 10, and the matchup is great. In head-to-head matches, he did have 3 assists the last time these guys played in a very low-scoring game. So the reason why I took DeAndre Ayton's PRA, let me check this out. So his PRA, he's covered in 8 out of his last 10 games, and he's absolutely crushed this line. He's got a very good matchup for rebounds and assists. Points-wise, he's been scoring very well lately, and that matchup is not difficult. He did score 18 points against them last time, but he's playing much better now than he was back then. The Trailblazers obviously have a lot of injuries, so he's going to get a lot of opportunities. And when I checked his historical form against Jonas Valanciunas, I think he's covered this in four consecutive games now against Jonas Valanciunas. So back in DeAndre Ayton have a big game. I've got the over. He's 33.5 PRA. Let's see how we go. But who else do we have? Anthony Simons. His points prop is a 23.5. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10 games. He's got a difficult matchup against the Pels, and he's gone under in 3 consecutive games against them. His assist prop, 5 out of his last 10, and 1 out of his last 3 against the Pels. So I'd honestly fade his points plus assists against the Pelicans in this one. Take the under 29.5. His 3-point market, he's covered in 7 out of his last 10, taken a lot of 3-pointers. Almost 10 3-pointers per game. Head-to-head matchups, he has only covered in 1 of his last 3, though, so he hasn't shot very well against them. These other guys for Portland, I don't think they're worth looking into, so let's jump into the next one. It's the Oklahoma City Thunder versus the Memphis Grizzlies, and obviously the Grizzlies will have a stack of players out, even from the players who've been playing recently. Pippen, Desmond Bane could be making a return, Aldama, Jaren Jackson Jr., they're all game-time decisions, as well as Vince Williams, so there's mainly just markets for the guys from OKC, and as I can report, they're fully healthy, so they're looking pretty good. Now, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, his points prop, 30.5. So he's covered this in 7 out of his last 10 games. Good matchup here against Memphis. He's gone under in 4 straight games against Memphis because OKC continue to blow them out. They've won 4 consecutive games by 11 points or more. Their last 3 games, they've won by 20 points or more, and SGA hasn't had to do too much. Looking at his assist prop, that's at 5.5. He's covered this in 4 out of his last 10, and he's hit this in 3 out of 4 games against the Grizzlies. Then you look at his rebounds prop, it's 5.5, covering in 6 of his last 10. He's got a great matchup, but he's only covered in 2 out of his last 4. So no bets on him for this one. Next one I want to talk through is Josh Giddey. So I've taken a bet on Josh Giddey here, taken the PRA. I'll go through all these props and then I'll explain the PRA play. So his line for scoring is at 11.5. He's hit this in 6 of his last 10, 3 consecutive games now. The matchup against Memphis, somewhat difficult, but Memphis, their lineup is changing over and over again, right? So I wouldn't put too much stock in how they defend a certain position. In head-to-head matchups, he's covered this in 3 out of his last 4 games against the Grizzlies. Looking at his assist prop, that's at 3.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10. The matchup's not too bad, and he's hit this in 4 consecutive games against the Grizzlies. And then you look at his rebound prop. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10. The matchup's not too difficult, and he's absolutely smashed this in his last 3 games against the Grizzlies. And the game he went under, he finished with 6 rebounds. So we flick over to his PRA, and we can see he's crushed his PRA in 4 consecutive games against the Grizzlies, which is good. Most notably, their most recent game less than a week ago. He had 16 points, 10 rebounds, and 4 assists, and he did that in only 9 minutes in another blowout win. So I do like that. If we look at his last 10, he's actually covered his PRA in 6 consecutive games now. 7 out of his last 10, but in 6 consecutive games, so I do like that. And then I went back to check his form against the Grizzlies, and throughout his whole career, he's covered his PRA in every single game against them. So obviously, we've got the last 4 games, which you could see back on Outlier. And then the 5th game, which isn't recorded on Outlier, he had 19 points, 5 rebounds, and 11 assists. So 5 career games against the Grizzlies, and he's absolutely crushed his PRA against them. I've got money on him to do it again. So I like the matchup there for Josh Giddey. Having a look at Jalen Williams, though, his points prop 18.5. He's covered this in 6 out of his last 10, and he's gone under in all 4 games against the Memphis Grizzlies. So obviously a lot of blowouts. Jalen Williams, SGA, not required to do too much. I don't know. Does Desmond Bain play in Memphis slightly stronger than they normally are? Look, potentially, but yeah, historically, Jalen Williams has struggled against him in the past. Assist wise, 4.5. He's covered this in 4 of his last 10, 3 out of his last 5 against them. And then his rebound prop here, 3.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10, but only 2 of 5 against the Grizzlies. Chet Holmgren, so his points prop is 14.5 in this game. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10. In head-to-head matchups, he's covered in 1 of 2 against the Grizzlies. His rebound numbers, 8.5 is the line in this one. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10, and he's gone under this in his last 2 games against the Grizzlies. So I know the matchup is good, but 8.5 seems like a pretty high number for someone like Chet. And then his assist, 2.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10, but he's gone under in his last 2. So you can see that SGA, Jalen Williams, Chet Holmgren typically go under their lines when there's a blowout, especially up against Memphis, whereas someone like Josh Giddey and maybe even potentially Lou Dort, they tend to go over in these matchups. So let's check out Lou Dort real quick. So his points props at 10.5. He's covered this in 6 out of his last 10 games. He's got a good matchup, and check this out. He's gone over in 3 consecutive games against the Grizzlies. Looking at his assist prop, it's only 1.5. He's covered in 5 of his last 10, 2 of his last 4 against the Grizz. And then his rebound prop at 3.5, only 4 of his last 10, 2 out of his last 4 against the Grizzlies. So probably he's just his scoring prop. He seems to benefit in head-to-head matchups here against Memphis. But I think Josh Giddey is a better play based on what we've seen historically. Let's jump into the next one. It's the Washington Wizards against the Chicago Bulls. Now, in this game, Denny Advia is a game-time decision. Ayo Dosunmu, I believe, and Kobe White are game-time decisions as well. You can also add Rashawn Holmes and Tyus Jones to that list as well. So I'd say limited markets available, but let's see what we got here. Kyle Kuzma. So his points prop, 22.5. He's covered in 9 out of his last 10. So I'm not looking at positional data too much here because, again, he's starting at center. We know he's not a center. If anything, he's a small forward, potentially a power forward, you can call him, but starting at center for some reason. You can only imagine Vucevic eating them up inside, but let's talk about Kuzma here. 9 out of his last 10 games, he's covered this points line, but against the Bulls, he's only hit this once out of his last 4. His assist props at 4.5. He's covered this in 4 out of his last 10 games. He's got under in 4 straight games against the Bulls. And then rebound-wise, 7.5. He started at center against Houston, and you think he'd get more rebounds? He only got 3. So lines at 7.5. He's covered in 4 of his last 10, and he's gone under his last 4 games against the Chicago Bulls. A very strong lean for me at the moment. He's probably an under in his rebounds plus assists. Under in 5 out of his last 10, but he's considerably under in his last 4 games against Chicago. But what I would wait for is to see Denny Advia, Rashawn Holmes. You need to see the status of those. So Advia, great rebounder. Rashawn Holmes would get some minutes at center. Tyus Jones, obviously their number 1 playmaker on offense, so he'll get the lion's share of assists. So didn't want to take any bets on Kyle Kuzma until the lineups were decided there. As for Denny Advia, let's quickly check him out. Again, he's someone I look at every time and I never bet on, but his points line, 15.5, 6 out of his last 10, but he struggled against the Bulls in every single game. Assist-wise, you're looking at 3.5. He's covered in 3 of his last 10, 2 out of his last 4 against the Bulls. And then his rebound line is at 8.5, 6 out of his last 10 games. Had 20 rebounds in a game against the Bulls once, but has covered in 2 out of his last 4. So once again, not betting on him, but those are the numbers. Let's head over to DeMar DeRozan. Now his points prop here is he's covered in his last 10. It's 26.5, so it's very high. The Wizards, after all, do allow the most points in the NBA. And in head-to-head matchups, DeMar DeRozan's covered this in 3 consecutive games. His assist line's at 5.5. He's covered in 3 out of his last 10, 2 out of his last 3 against the Wizards. And then his rebound props at 5.5, 5 out of his last 10, and 2 out of his last 3 against the Wizards. So none of that I really felt good about. Now, Vucevic has one of the best matchups on paper you can imagine for someone like him. The Wizards don't defend centers very well at all, but Vucevic, his line's at 22.5. He's only covered in 4 out of his last 10. Even against Wizards, in their soft matchup, he's only covered in 2 of his last 4. So he's gone under in his last 2 games. Rebound-wise, he's got an excellent matchup as well. But his line's at 12.5, a little bit higher than usual. He's covered in 2 of his last 10 games. But even against the Wizards, he's only covered in 1 out of his last 4. So, yeah, Vucevic, great matchup. His lines are obviously elevated, and historical performance isn't that great either. Ayo Desonmu, his game time decision, but let's see what he's packing. So, points-wise, he's covered in 3 out of his last 10, and he's gone under in 4 games against Washington. Assist-wise, it's 5.5. 5 out of his last 10, gone under in 4 straight games against Washington. And his rebound prop, 4.5. 3 out of his last 10, 1 of his last 4 against the Wizards. If you want to look at his 3-point prop, because that's been quite popular as of late, but he hasn't even been hitting. So 5 out of his last 10 and under in 4 straight games against the Wizards. So we're not really feeling him. Now, Alex Caruso, he's actually been scoring quite well as of late. Last 2 games, he's been scoring like a madman, but that's because Kobe White hasn't been in the lineup. Kobe White might return in this game. So I'm not going to go through all of his props, but what I'm saying is be hesitant if you want to bet on his points prop, because as you can see, his points prop prior to Kobe White being injured, he was going under every single time. But if Kobe White doesn't suit up, then this might be a good option for you because the matchup is definitely there. Jumping into the next one, it's the Golden State Warriors versus the Los Angeles Lakers. Fortunately, we've got Draymond, Steph Curry, Anthony Davis, LeBron James, all game time decisions. What a terrible game if all 4 of these weren't to play. We'll start with the Golden State Warriors first. We've got Jonathan Kuminga. So his points prop here is at 18.5. He's covered this in 9 of his last 10 games, which is bloody excellent. Head-to-head matchups, though, he's only covered in 1 out of his last 10 games against the Los Angeles Lakers, so that's not good. Looking at his assist prop, it's 2.5, only 3 of his last 10, and only 2 of his last 10 against LA. And then rebound-wise, 5.5, 5 out of his last 10. Difficult matchup, and he's covered in 2 of his last 10 against the Lakers. So someone like Jonathan Kuminga, definitely his points prop would be the way to go if you had to bet it. But I think it's worth potentially waiting on the Steph Curry news, or probably not. Like, I don't think his line's going to move. His line can only move up, and that's if Steph Curry is actually ruled out. Then you'll see Kuminga's line move up. So I think that should be sitting around 21, 22.5 if Steph Curry's not there. So if you can get him at 18.5, it might be worth a play, to be honest, because he can hit that with Steph Curry in the lineup. But I haven't made a decision on that, so I'm still a bit on the fence. Who else have we got? We've got lines for Steph Curry, by the way. So the Chef, his line is at 24.5. We don't know if he's playing. He's got a pretty decent matchup. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10, and he's covered in 8 out of his last 10 games against the Los Angeles Lakers, which is crazy. His assist line's at 4.5. He's covered that in 6 of his last 10, and he's hit that in 8 out of his last 10 against the Lakers. Just wild. His 3-point prop, 4.5. 4 of his last 10 games. He's only hit this in 4 of his last 10 against the Lakers. And his rebound prop, 4.5. 4 of his last 10 games. And only 4 of his games against the Lakers. So points plus assists, that could be a good play. So he's hit that in 8 of his last 10 games against the Lakers. The matchup's not too bad for both props. And in his last 10 games, he has only hit this in 4 of his last 10. But if you're a big believer in the head-to-head matchup, yada, 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 then yeah, Steph Curry points and assists could be a good play. But I don't like betting on players who are game time decisions outside of LeBron and AD because they're listed as game time and then they play most of the time. So, all right, we're taking a look at the King, LeBron James in this one. Lines are 26.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10. The matchup with the Warriors isn't too bad, but he's only covered this line in 4 of his last 9 games, but he has covered in his last 2 against them. His 3-point prop, that's at 2.5 now. Used to be 1.5 for ages. He's gone under in 6 straight. He's only covered in 3 of his last 10 and in only 3 of 9 against the Warriors. Assist-wise, his line's at 9.5. It's plus money, but 9.5. He's hit this in only 2 of his last 10 games, and he's hit this in 1 of 9 head-to-head matchups with the Warriors. His rebound line's at 7.5. 3 of his last 10, but 3 of his last 4, really. And he's hit this in 8 of his last 9 games against the Warriors. His last game against the Warriors, he had 20 rebounds in that game, which is absolutely crazy. So, yeah, I don't mind that for LeBron James, to be honest. I need to look into that one a little bit further. I missed my initial analysis there. So LeBron James, overs and boards. Need to check him out. Who else have we got to look through? D'Lo. So I think D'Lo to score some points might be a popular pick in this game. Let's check it out. 6 out of his last 10 games, he's covered 17.5 points. The matchup with the Warriors is a good one. In head-to-head matchups, D'Lo's covered in 3 consecutive games now, 5 out of his last 10 games. His 3-point market's at 3.5. It's plus money. He's hit this in 4 of his last 10, 2 of his last 10 against the Warriors. And assist-wise, 5.5. He's covered in 6 of his last 10, 4 of his last 10 against the Warriors. So his points prop is honestly isn't too bad. I know the matchup is great. He's hit that the last 3 times he's versed the Warriors. Both of those games were within the last year. In his last 10, he had some 2 slow games against Minnesota and the Sacramento Kings. Both of those games in which the Lakers did lose, by the way. In this game, the Lakers are 3.5-point favorite, so you should expect D'Angelo Russell to play a lot better. And Austin Reeves, his points prop seems a little bit higher than usual, 16.5. Now, he's hit this in 4 consecutive games now, so it probably makes sense. 5 out of his last 10, 5 out of his last 6, really. But in head-to-head matchups, he's covered in 4 of his last 12 against the Warriors. His 3-point prop, that's at 2.5. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 6 games, which is pretty crazy. And in head-to-head matchups, 4 of his last 12. If you like his assists, lines at 5.5. 4 of his last 10. He's only hit in 3 of his last 12 against the Warriors. So, yeah, his points prop, he's shooting quite well as of late. But yeah, I'd be a little bit hesitant to take him. Anthony Davis against the Warriors. What do we got? Lines at 25.5. 3 of his last 10 games. He's hit in his last 2 against the Warriors. 5 out of his last 12. His rebound prop, you're looking at 13.5. He's covered this in 3 of his last 10 games. Did have 15 rebounds the last time he played the Warriors, and he's hit this in 5 out of his last 12. Assist prop, 3.5. 4 of his last 10. And 3 of his last 12 against the Warriors. He's actually gone under in 6 consecutive games against them. So no surprise to see that one for plus money. Jumping into the next game, it's the Minnesota Timberwolves versus Utah Jazz. Limited markets in this one. Kyle Anderson, Rudy Gobert, both game time decisions. And for the Utah Jazz, Lauri Markkanen, Chris Dunn, Clarkson, Tyler Hendricks, all game time decisions as well. So I wouldn't be taking any bets on this game until you know who's playing, because any of those players come in and a lot of these lines are going to shift dramatically. But we'll start with John Collins. I initially thought about an under because he could be up against Rudy Gobert, but then we don't know if Rudy's going to be playing. So John Collins, his points props at 15.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10. Matchup is difficult, of course. He's got under in his last 2 against Minnesota. His rebound prop, 10.5. He's covered in 4 of his last 10. 1 of his last 2 against the Timberwolves. Colin Sexton, points props at 19.5. He's covered in 5 of his last 10. 1 of his last 5 against the Timberwolves. And his assist props at 5.5. He's covered in 4 of his last 10. And he's gone under in 4 straight games against the Timberwolves too. So, difficult matchup for him. Keontae George, of course, he's got a tough matchup as well. He's now hit his points prop in 3 consecutive games. We took his over against Atlanta, 19.5. He finished on 25. So he's hit this in 4 of his last 5 games. The game where he scored nothing, he only played a few minutes and he was sick. So I can give him a pass for that one. But as of late, his recent form's been excellent. Against the Timberwolves, he's gone under in 2 consecutive games, though. His assist prop, 5.5. He's covered this in 6 of his last 10, but he went under in his last 2 against the Timberwolves. Have a look at Mike Conley. Now, Mike's points prop is 11.5. He's hit this in 5 of his last 10. He's also gone under in his last 2 against his old team. Assist-wise, 3 of his last 10, 1 out of his last 2 against Utah. Anthony Edwards, his points prop, 29.5. Matchup, somewhat difficult against the Utah Jazz, but he's covered this in 4 out of his last 10. He has covered this in 3 out of his last 5 against Utah. Looking at his assists, the line's at 4.5. He's covered in 3 of his last 10, but he has covered in 3 of his last 5, but 3 consecutive games against Utah. Rebound-wise, 5.5 the line. He's hit this in 4 of his last 10, 3 out of his last 5 against the Utah Jazz. So, yeah, I'd be a bit hesitant betting on any of those players, purely because there's so many game time decisions. Then our very last game is the New York Knicks versus Sacramento Kings. OG Anunoby and Kevin Huerter. Game time decisions in this game. So they're not market movers. So I give the green light. If you find something good in this game, feel free to bet it. Let's start with New York. Josh Hart. So his points prop 12.5. I feel like the 2 games where he's gone under just happened to be 2 games where I bet him. So it was pretty unfortunate. But he's hit this points prop of 12.5 in 8 out of his last 10. Scored 9 points in his last game against the Sacramento Kings. His assist props at 4.5. He's hit this in 7 of his last 10. And he hit 7 assists the last time against the Kings, but his recent form started to fall off. And then his rebound prop, still rebounding like a beast, of course. 6 out of his last 10 games, had 15 rebounds in his last one. And he had 15 rebounds against the Sacramento Kings in the last game. So pretty crazy that someone of his size can get this many rebounds. I'm not taking any bets on Josh Hart, but, he's rebounding extremely well right now. OG, his points prop, 13.5. His matchup with the Kings is a good one. He's covered this in 8 out of his last 10, but he's yet to verse the Sacramento Kings. Out of all of his props, the points one is the only one you really should take. Yeah, I'm a bit on the fence on that one. We've got Jalen Brunson. So his points props at 27.5. He's hit this in 4 out of his last 10. Just scored 45 points on the Portland Trailblazers. Head-to-head matchups against the Kings hasn't gone well for him. He's gone under in his last 2. Assist-wise, that line's at 7.5. He's hit this in 5 out of his last 10. Gone under in his last 2 games against the Kings as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if he has a great game, but historically he's, found it difficult against Sacramento. Dante DiVincenzo, he's got a good matchup in this one. His recent form's not great. He's hit in 4 of his last 10, gone under in 4 straight. His 3-point prop is at 3.5. He's hit that in 6 of his last 10. Does have a good matchup here. And his assist market, 3.5 as well. 5 out of his last 10. Rebounds, 4.5. He's hit this in 4 out of his last 10. So he doesn't have a good matchup for scoring. He just hasn't been scoring very well. Looking at the Sacramento Kings players, who we have? De'Aaron Fox. So I think I'm just double checking. I've got a bet on De'Aaron Fox here. So we'll get to that in a minute. We'll go through his lines and I'll tell you what I bet on. His points props at 25.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10, which is great. Head-to-head wise, scored 23 points in his last game against the New York Knicks, though. Looking at his assist numbers, that line's at 5.5. He's hit this in 7 out of his last 10 games. Matchup, somewhat difficult, but he's covered it in the past. 7 assists against the New York Knicks in the past. Rebound-wise, his line's at 4.5. Only had 3 rebounds last time against the Knicks. He's covered this in 7 out of his last 10 games, though, and the matchup is somewhat difficult. So the pick I ended up taking, I took the over in his rebounds plus assists in this game. And check this out. So 9.5 is what I took. He's hit this in 9 out of his last 10 games. The matchup is somewhat difficult, so we see a lower line, right? But he has covered in 9 of his last 10. Some of these matchups he's faced has been somewhat difficult, like that Miami one is a difficult matchup. The Chicago one, that's a difficult matchup too. So he's covered in difficult matchups in the past. 9 out of his last 10 games. He had 10 in his last game against New York, 7 assists and 3 rebounds. I did a deeper dive on StatsMuse to look at his rebounds plus assists. And what we can see is dating back to 2021, he's versed the Knicks 4 times, and he's covered this rebounds plus assist line in all 4 games. So don't mind the historical form there for De'Aaron Fox, plus his recent form. I took that and got pretty decent odds for it too. So De'Aaron Fox, that's what I'm taking. Malik Monk, let's check him out. His points prop, 17.5. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10 games. In head-to-head matchups, he's covered in 1 of 2 against the New York Knicks. His assist prop, 9 out of his last 10 games, he's covered 4.5. It is juiced, minus 156. He did have 5 assists last time he versed them, 1 assist prior to that. So, yeah, I was close to betting his assist prop, but those odds kind of scared me away. A little bit too low for my liking. Who else is there? Domantas Sabonis. So his points prop in this game is 19.5. He's covered this in 4 out of his last 10. Difficult matchup here against the Knicks, but Sabonis has covered this in 2 consecutive games against them. His assist prop, that's at 8.5. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10 games. He's got a difficult matchup, but he had 10 assists the last time he played the Knicks. And rebound-wise, that line's at 14.5. He's hit this in 7 out of his last 10 games. The man's a rebounding machine. Last game against the Knicks, 13 and 12. So he has gone under in both games, but his rebounding form as of late is absolutely berserk. So, yeah, nothing on that that I like. I just really tried to rein things in. I could have probably had 15 bets on the slate of games, but after a tough run, I've decided to rein it in a little bit. I think I landed on 5 or 6 bets for today, but I'll have those in the pinned comment when I upload because the bet's already done. Look at Miles Bridges rebounds and LeBron James rebounds as well, and then I'll make my final decisions from there. So I do have another video coming out tomorrow kind of showing all the different factors that I look at before I do place a bet. So it's more than just looking at what you see on Outlier or any of those apps. There's a lot more that goes into it. So I'll be uploading that tomorrow. So stay tuned for that one. But look, if you have been tailing my bets, I apologize because those have been absolutely shithouse for the last few days. I completely own that. The research is sound. It's just not coming off for me, but hopefully a change in strategy. I did my bets first before I started recording this video. So hopefully it all works out for us. But if you do want to see more of my content, just click on this thing up here. I think I'm pointing in the right direction. Point right here. Click on the link and you'll see a little bit more of me. But you know what I do? I'll be back here tomorrow. Same thing again. I'll show you the updated slate and hopefully we get to celebrate some of our winners. Now let's go.
Sub to the channel cause your boy's getting busy. Coming to your line from the west side of Sydney. We've got the free picks and the juice on the daily. It's all free, you don't even have to pay me.